On a blazing September morning in 1897, 21 Sikh soldiers stood on a rocky ridge in the treacherous mountains of the northwest frontier, staring into the dust clouds of an approaching army that outnumbered them nearly 500 to 1. What they witnessed that day would become one of history's most extraordinary last stands, a battle so fierce and so defiant that when news reached the British Parliament in London, every member rose to their feet in a standing ovation. This is the story of Saragarhi, where courage met impossibility and legends were forged in blood and steel. The year 1897 had brought fire to the frontier. Across the rugged borderlands between British India and Afghanistan, tribal warriors answered the call of jihad, their war cries echoing through mountain passes that had witnessed countless battles. At the center of this storm stood a small stone outpost called Saragarhi, perched like an eagle's nest on a narrow ridge between two vital British forts. Inside its walls, 21 men of the 36th Sikhs prepared to face an enemy so vast that their own commanders could count 14 battle standards advancing toward them, each one representing 1,000 warriors hungry for British blood. The strategic importance of this tiny outpost cannot be overstated. Saragarhi was more than just another military position. It was the crucial communication link between Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan, two fortresses that could not see each other across the broken terrain. Without Saragarhi's heliograph station flashing coded messages between the peaks, the entire defensive line would collapse into blind chaos. The tribal leaders knew this. They understood that capturing this single outpost would leave both major forts isolated and vulnerable. What they did not anticipate was the steel-hard resolve of the men standing in their path. Leading these defenders was Havildar Ishar Singh, a man whose very presence commanded respect. Born in 1,858 inches, the village of Joran, near Jagraon in Punjab's Ludhiana district, Singh had spent nearly 2 decades on the violent frontier. His superiors called him a turbulent character, a man whose independent nature often brought him into conflict with authority. Yet in the field, they acknowledged him as magnificent, a natural leader who understood both the terrain and the enemy better than most officers twice his rank. At 39 years old, Singh was a veteran warrior who had witnessed the brutal realities of frontier warfare, where mercy was a luxury few could afford and survival depended on quick thinking and quicker reflexes. The men under Singh's command were cut from similar cloth. These were not fresh recruits dreaming of glory, but seasoned soldiers who had chosen to serve on the most dangerous frontier in the British Empire. The 36 Sikhs had been formed just 3 years earlier, in 1894, composed entirely of Jat Sikhs from the Punjab. These men shared a common faith, a common culture, and a common understanding of what it meant to stand firm when the odds turned against you. They had been stationed at Saragarhi for months, watching the political situation deteriorate as tribal unrest spread like wildfire across the region. The source of this uprising lay in the complex web of frontier politics and religious fervor. Najmuddin Akhundzada, known as the Mullah of Hadda, had declared jihad in August 1897, his fiery sermons igniting the passions of the Afridi and Orakzai tribes. These were not simple raiders seeking plunder, but organized warriors fighting what they believed to be a holy war against foreign occupation. The British plans to define the border had been seen as an unacceptable encroachment, and the tribal leaders had spent weeks preparing for a coordinated assault that would drive the British from their mountain strongholds forever. For the defenders of Saragarhi, the morning of September 12th began like any other. The sun rose over the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the valleys below. Sepoy Gurmukh Singh, the detachment signaller, climbed the stone steps to the heliograph station atop the communications tower, preparing for another day of routine message relays between the forts. The other soldiers went about their morning duties, checking weapons, preparing meals, and scanning the approaches for any sign of unusual activity. Then, at approximately 9 o'clock, the horizon began to change. Through his binoculars, Havildar Ishar Singh watched as dust clouds appeared in the distance, growing larger and darker with each passing minute. What he saw defied belief. Column after column of armed tribesmen emerged from the mountain passes, their weapons glinting in the morning sun, their battle cries growing louder as they advanced. This was not a raiding party or a reconnaissance force. This was an army, and it was heading directly towards Saragarhi. Singh's experienced eye quickly assessed the situation. He counted the standards, estimated the numbers, and realized the terrible truth. His 21 men faced an enemy force of at least 10,000 warriors, possibly more. The odds were not just unfavorable, they were catastrophic. Yet retreat was not an option. Behind them lay the two major forts, their garrisons unaware of the approaching storm. If Saragarhi fell without a fight, both Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan would be overrun before they could organize their defenses. Sepoy Gurmukh Singh's heliograph began flashing urgently toward Fort Lockhart. The coded message was brief and chilling. Enemy approaching the main gate. Need reinforcement. The reply came back swiftly, but it carried no comfort. Lieutenant Colonel Horton, commanding the garrison at Fort Lockhart, could see the approaching enemy from his own position. He counted at least 14 standards, each representing 1,000 men. His response was equally brief. Unable to break through. Hold position. Those three words, hold position, sealed the fate of the 21 men at Saragarhi. They would receive no reinforcements, no relief column, no miraculous rescue. They would stand alone against an enemy that outnumbered them nearly 500 to 1. Yet when Havildar Ishar Singh gathered his men and explained their situation, not a single soldier suggested retreat. These were Sikhs, raised on stories of Guru Gobind Singh and the battles of their ancestors. They understood that some positions must be held regardless of the cost, that some sacrifices echo through history long after the last shot is fired. The defenders quickly organized their meager resources. 21 rifles, several hundred rounds of ammunition, their ceremonial swords, and the stone walls of Saragarhi itself. The outpost was small, consisting of a blockhouse with loopholed ramparts and the vital signaling tower. It had been built for communication, not for withstanding a siege by thousands of warriors. Yet Singh and his men set about preparing their defenses with the methodical efficiency of professional soldiers who knew their business. The weapons they carried were Martini Henry rifles, single-shot breech loaders that had entered British service in 1871. These rifles fired 303 caliber rounds and were capable of 10 shots per minute in the hands of a trained soldier. With an effective range of 600 yards, they were superior to the muzzle-loading weapons carried by many of the tribal warriors. However, the defenders faced a cruel irony. Many of their enemies carried copies of the same Martini Henry rifles, manufactured by skilled gunsmiths in the tribal areas who had reverse-engineered captured British weapons. The technological advantage that might have evened the odds had largely disappeared. As the morning wore on, the enemy force continued to grow. Warriors from different tribes converged on Saragarhi, their leaders coordinating the assault that would begin one of the most remarkable defensive actions in military history. The stage was set for a battle that would test the limits of human courage and determination, where 21 men would stand against impossible odds and write their names in legend with their own blood. As the tribal army drew closer, the ground beneath Saragarhi began to tremble with the rhythm of thousands of marching feet. The air filled with dust and the harsh calls of war horns echoing between the mountain peaks. From his position in the watchtower, Havildar Ishar Singh could see the enemy formations spreading across the valley floor like a dark tide, their colorful banners snapping in the mountain wind. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying, a display of martial power that few men had ever witnessed and lived to describe. The tribal forces were not a disorganized mob, but a coordinated army with clear tactical objectives. The Afridi and Oruxai warriors had spent weeks planning this assault, studying the British positions and identifying the weak points in their defensive line. They understood that Saragarhi was the key to the entire operation. Capture this single outpost, and the two major forts would be isolated and vulnerable. Their leaders had promised their warriors that victory here would open the road to driving the British from the frontier forever. At the head of this vast force rode the tribal commanders, men whose names were whispered with respect and fear throughout the region. These were not mere bandits or raiders, but seasoned warriors who had spent their lives fighting in these mountains. They had studied British tactics, learned from previous defeats, and adapted their strategies accordingly. Some carried modern rifles captured from British forces or purchased from arms dealers. Others wielded traditional weapons passed down through generations of fighting men. All were united by a common purpose and a shared belief that God favored their cause. The defenders watched this approaching storm with the calm of professional soldiers who had long ago made peace with their mortality. There was no panic, no desperate prayers, only the quiet efficiency of men preparing for battle. They distributed ammunition carefully, each man receiving his allotted rounds with the understanding that every shot must count. The heavier weapons were positioned to cover the most likely approaches, while the signaling equipment was secured to ensure communication could continue as long as possible. Sepoy Gurmukh Singh remained at his heliograph station, his fingers dancing across the coded keys as he transmitted a steady stream of intelligence to Fort Lockhart. His messages painted a grim picture of the enemy's strength and disposition. Estimate 12,000 warriors approaching from multiple directions, he flashed. Cavalry elements moving to surround position. Artillery pieces observed. Each transmission brought acknowledgement from the fort, but no promise of relief. Lieutenant Colonel Horton was fighting his own battle, desperately trying to organize a breakthrough that seemed increasingly impossible. The first shots of the battle rang out just before 10 o'clock, as tribal skirmishers probed the defenses with long-range fire. The distinctive crack of Martini Henry rifles echoed across the ridge as both sides tested each other's resolve. The Sikhs held their fire, waiting for clear targets and conserving their precious ammunition. They knew that once the real assault began, every round would be worth its weight in gold. From his command position, Havildar Ishar Singh studied the enemy's movements with the eye of an experienced tactician. He could see them massing for the first major assault, warriors gathering in the dead ground below the ridge, where the defenders' fire could not reach them. Smoke began to rise from the surrounding brush as the attackers set fires to create a screen for their advance. The acrid smell of burning vegetation mixed with the dust and cordite in the air, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and impending violence. The tribal commanders had learned from previous encounters with British forces. They knew that frontal assaults against disciplined troops in prepared positions were costly and often futile. Instead, they planned a more sophisticated attack, using the terrain and their superior numbers to maximum advantage. While the main force demonstrated against the front of the position, smaller groups would work their way around the flanks, seeking weak points in the defenses or opportunities to infiltrate the compound. As the morning progressed, the tempo of fire increased steadily. Individual shots gave way to volleys as larger groups of warriors advanced and were driven back by the defenders' accurate shooting. The Sikhs fought with the methodical precision that came from years of training and experience. They did not waste ammunition on long shots or wild firing, but waited for clear targets and made each round count. The enemy bodies beginning to accumulate in front of the position testified to their marksmanship. Yet for every warrior who fell, two more seemed to take his place. The tribal army was vast enough to absorb casualties that would have shattered smaller forces. Their commanders could afford to spend men freely in the early stages of the battle, using these attacks to probe the defenses and identify vulnerabilities. The real assault would come later, when the defenders were tired and running low on ammunition. Inside Saragarhi, the atmosphere remained calm but focused. The soldiers rotated positions to prevent fatigue, shared water from their limited supplies, and maintained their weapons with the care of men who knew their lives depended on every mechanical function working perfectly. Havildar Ishar Singh moved constantly among his men, offering encouragement, adjusting their positions, and ensuring that the defense remained coordinated and effective. The heliograph continued its steady chatter, Sepoy Gurmukh Singh's skilled fingers maintaining the vital link to the outside world, even as bullets whistled around his position. His messages became increasingly urgent as the situation deteriorated. First assault repelled with heavy enemy casualties, he transmitted. Ammunition holding steady, morale remains high. These reports provided Lieutenant Colonel Horton with real-time intelligence on the battle's progress, but they also served another purpose. They were creating a historical record of extraordinary courage under fire. By midday, the character of the battle had begun to change. The tribal forces had completed their reconnaissance and were preparing for more serious assaults. Smoke screens thickened around the position as the attackers used fire and terrain to mask their movements. The sound of digging could be heard from multiple directions as enemy engineers began undermining operations, seeking to breach the walls through tunneling rather than direct assault. The defenders adapted their tactics accordingly. Listening posts were established to detect underground activity, while sentries watched for signs of infiltration attempts. The limited size of their force meant that every man had multiple responsibilities, switching between roles as the tactical situation demanded. There were no reserves, no relief troops waiting in the rear. Every defender was committed to the front line from the moment the battle began. As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the rocky terrain, both sides prepared for the decisive phase of the battle. The tribal commanders had spent the morning gathering intelligence and positioning their forces. Now they were ready to unleash the full fury of their army against the tiny outpost that stood defiantly in their path. The defenders checked their weapons one final time, knowing that the real test was about to begin. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the defenders as the tribal army completed its preparations for the main assault. Through the shimmering heat, Havildar Ishar Singh could see the enemy formations taking shape, thousands of warriors organizing themselves into assault columns that stretched beyond the limits of his vision. The morning skirmishing had been merely the overture to this deadly symphony. Now the real battle was about to begin. The first coordinated attack came with a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. Wave after wave of tribal warriors surged up the slope towards Saragarhi, their battle cries echoing off the canyon walls like the voices of demons unleashed from the depths of hell. The defenders met them with disciplined volleys, their Martini Henry rifles cracking in deadly rhythm as they poured fire into the advancing masses. Bodies tumbled down the rocky incline. Yet still the attackers came, driven by religious fervor and the promise of victory. From his position at the heliograph, Sepoy Gurmukh Singh continued his relentless transmission of battlefield intelligence. His messages grew shorter now, more urgent, as the situation deteriorated with each passing hour. Enemy breaching outer perimeter, he flashed to Fort Lockhart, casualties mounting but holding firm. The responses from Lieutenant Colonel Horton carried increasing desperation. Every attempt to organize a relief column had been thwarted by the sheer size of the tribal army, which had systematically cut off all approaches to the beleaguered outpost. The second assault came before the defenders had fully recovered from the first. This time, the attackers used the cover of burning brush more effectively, advancing through the smoke and flame like phantoms emerging from the underworld. The Sikhs adjusted their tactics, firing blind into the smoke clouds where movement could be detected, trusting their experience and instincts to find targets they could not clearly see. The acrid smoke burned their eyes and throats, making every breath a struggle. Yet they maintained their positions with the stoic determination that had made their regiment famous throughout the frontier. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, ammunition was becoming a critical concern. Each defender had started the day with a basic load of cartridges, but the intensity of the fighting had consumed their supplies at an alarming rate. Havildar Ishar Singh made the difficult decision to implement strict fire discipline, ordering his men to make every shot count and to hold their fire except for the clearest targets. The psychological pressure was immense, watching enemy warriors advance while being forced to conserve precious ammunition for the most critical moments. The tribal commanders, sensing the defenders' weakness, pressed their advantage with ruthless efficiency. They had learned from the morning's failures, adapting their tactics to exploit every crack in Saragarhi's defenses. Small groups of warriors began infiltrating the dead ground around the outpost, using natural cover and the confusion of battle to work their way closer to the walls. These infiltrators carried explosives and scaling equipment, tools that would prove devastatingly effective against the limited fortifications. The third major assault struck with unprecedented fury. The enemy had massed nearly 2,000 warriors for this attack, more men than had ever been thrown against a single British outpost in frontier history. They advanced in multiple columns, coordinating their approach to overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of war cries, rifle fire, and the clash of steel on stone that seemed to drown out all other sensation. Inside the compound, the situation had become desperate. Several defenders had been wounded by enemy fire, reducing the already inadequate garrison to a handful of effective fighters. Medical supplies were non-existent, forcing wounded men to bind their own injuries and continue fighting despite their pain. The walls of Saragarhi bore the scars of countless bullet impacts, and in several places, the stonework had begun to crumble under the relentless assault. Sepoy Gurmukh Singh's heliograph messages now carried an unmistakable note of finality. "Ammunition critical," he transmitted. "Wounded mounting. Request immediate assistance." The reply from Fort Lockhart was heartbreaking in its honesty. "Unable to reach you. Fight on. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten." These words, flashed in coded light across the mountain peaks, carried the weight of official recognition that the defenders of Saragarhi were on their own. The enemy's engineering efforts had also begun to bear fruit. The sound of picks and shovels working beneath the walls grew louder throughout the afternoon, and in several locations, the foundations had been significantly weakened. The tribal sappers worked with the patient skill of men who understood that time was on their side. They could afford to dig methodically while the defenders above them slowly exhausted their ammunition and strength. As the fourth assault began, a new sound joined the symphony of battle. The distinctive crack of stone giving way echoed across the compound as the first section of wall collapsed under the combined pressure of enemy fire and underground mining. A gap opened in Saragarhi's defenses, and through it poured a stream of tribal warriors, their weapons gleaming in the afternoon sunday. The defenders rushed to plug the breach, fighting hand-to-hand with bayonets and sword against curved blades and war clubs in a melee that tested the limits of human endurance. Havildar Ishar Singh was everywhere at once during this critical moment, rallying his men, directing fire, and personally engaging enemy infiltrators who had made it past the outer defenses. His uniform was torn and blood-stained, his face blackened by powder smoke, yet his voice remained strong and his commands clear. He embodied the spirit of resistance that kept his tiny garrison fighting against impossible odds. The tactical situation continued to deteriorate as the afternoon wore on. More sections of wall collapsed under enemy action, creating multiple breach points that stretched the defenders beyond their breaking point. The compound's interior became a maze of rubble and desperate fighting positions as the Sikhs fell back toward the central keep. Each withdrawal was conducted with military precision, the wounded being carried by their comrades even as enemy fire swept the courtyard. The heliograph station, perched atop the communications tower, remained operational despite repeated enemy attempts to destroy it. Sepoy Gurmukh Singh had become a priority target for tribal marksmen, who recognized the importance of cutting Saragarhi's link to the outside world. Bullets whistled constantly around his position, chipping stone and shattering equipment, yet he maintained his transmission schedule with mechanical regularity. By 4 o'clock, the defenders had been compressed into the final defensive position around the central blockhouse. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted, their casualties mounting, and their position increasingly untenable. Yet they continued to fight with a ferocity that amazed even their enemies. Every room became a fortress, every doorway a killing ground where desperate men sold their lives as dearly as possible. The tribal commanders recognized that victory was within their grasp, but they also understood the cost. Hundreds of their warriors lay dead around Saragarhi's walls, victims of the defenders' accurate fire and desperate resistance. The small outpost had exacted a price far beyond its apparent strategic value, bleeding the tribal army white in exchange for a few acres of rocky ground. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, both sides prepared for what everyone knew would be the final phase of the battle. The defenders gathered their remaining ammunition and checked their weapons one last time. The attackers massed for one overwhelming assault that would finally crush the stubborn resistance that had cost them so dearly. The stage was set for an ending that would echo through history, a conclusion written in blood and courage that would inspire generations yet unborn. The mountain wind carried the smell of gunpowder and death across the battlefield, mingling with the ancient scents of stone and sage that had perfumed these peaks since the dawn of time. In a few hours, the sun would set on one of the most extraordinary defensive actions in military history, but its memory would burn brightly after the last shot was fired. And in the hearts of men long the final warrior had fallen. When the relief column finally fought through to Saragarhi the following morning, they found only silence. The walls were shattered, the compound littered with the bodies of hundreds of tribal warriors, and at the center of it all, 21 Sikh soldiers who had kept their promise to hold the position. Not one had abandoned his post. Not one had surrendered. They had fought until their ammunition was exhausted, then with bayonets and swords, and finally with their bare hands until the last man fell. The heliograph tower still stood, though scarred by countless bullets. Sepoy Gurmukh Singh's final transmission had been received at Fort Lockhart, just as the sun set, fighting at close quarters. "This is my last message. We die for the honor of the regiment." Then the light had gone dark forever. When news of the battle reached London, the British Parliament rose as one in recognition of courage that transcended nationality or politics. All 21 defenders were posthumously awarded the Indian Order of Merit, the highest honor an Indian soldier could receive. No single action before or since has earned so many of these decorations in one day. Their sacrifice had saved both Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan, buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive and breaking the back of the tribal uprising. The Battle of Saragarhi stands as proof that courage is not measured by numbers or odds, but by the willingness to stand firm when everything depends on it. 21 men faced 10,000 and showed the world that some things are worth dying for. Their legacy echoes still in the regiments that bear their honors, and in the hearts of all who believe that duty transcends death itself.